So for the third reading today, I've chosen a passage from John's Gospel, from chapter 14. And it's the last day of Jesus' life. It's the Last Supper. And he's at his mystical, best. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, so that you also may be where I am. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. I will not leave you orphans. I will come to you. Before long, the world will not see me anymore, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. On that day, you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. These are words inspired by God. For the newcomers who are joining us today, it's my custom. I take a theme for each month, and I develop the theme for the first 2 Sundays of the month. And then on the third Sunday, I do a recap of those two and open up to a question and answer. So the theme I've chosen for the month of November is, I'm going to call it Thin Places Piercing the Veil. So today, November 3rd, I'm going to look at firstly, thin places and Celtic feasts. And then I'm going to talk about the communion of saints. And then I want to talk about indulgences. And then I'm going to end with a story about my grandfather, whom I call Daddy Jim. And then next Sunday, God willing, November 10th, I want to look at thin places and ghosts. And secondly, the other side of the veil. And then I want to end with a story I learned as a child called Jack and the Devil. So that's where we're going for the next 2 weeks, with God's help. So thin places and Celtic feasts. For Celts, they talked about the thin places. In Gaelic, we call them ÓLaoire, and thin places. And it literally means a kind of a portal. And there are 3 different levels of portal as far as I can determine. So a portal could be a special place. And for us Celts, it could be a lake, it could be a wood, it could be a single sacred tree standing alone in a fairy fort, like a whitethorn bush or an oak tree. Or a special place, a thin place could be a hill or a mountain, or it could be what we call in Gaelic kill, spelled C-I-L-L. And kill could be a graveyard or a church. And the reason for this is Irish Celtic Christianity, I believe, was not brought to Ireland by St. Patrick. It came much, much earlier than Patrick. It was not based on the Roman model of parishes and dioceses. Irish Celtic Christianity was built on the hut of a hermit. So desert fathers and desert mothers came across the Mediterranean at some stages, left Egypt and the deserts of Egypt, came across the Mediterranean, out through the Straits of Gibraltar, and up the west coast past Portugal and Spain, and landed in Ireland. And they found very remote areas in the wooded areas of Ireland, and they created their little huts. And when the local population realized that these were very holy men and women, they wanted their dead to be buried near them. And so when somebody died nearby, they'd want to bury their dead near the little hut of the hermit. And so in Gaelic, this word kill can mean a little church, or it can mean a graveyard. And so these were kind of sacred spaces as well. We also had what I would call kind of special times. So ancient Celtic feasts, like we had 4 great feasts. There was Imbolc, which was the 1st of February, and then Bealtaine, which was the 1st of May, and then Lunasa, which was the 1st of August, and finally Samhain, which is the 1st of November, which we're pretty much celebrating today. So November is a really interesting month for ÓLaoire and for thin places, because November the 1st is the feast of All Saints, and November the 2nd is the feast of All Souls, And November the 6th is the Feast of All the Saints of Ireland. So for us Celts, it's a very, very, the entire month itself is kind of a quiet, a thin place. Now it's interesting that the Catholic Church borrowed these thin places from pagan sites. Many of the great cathedrals of Europe are built where previously there had been ancient pagan sites. And they borrowed times, sacred times from pagan feasts like Christmas and Easter. These were much, much older pagan ceremonies and feasts. Now, as well as that kind of thin places and thin times, I believe there's another category, we can call it thin people, in the sense that special people who, they're what I would call walking tabernacles of mysticism. And if you're lucky enough to encounter such a person in your life, you're very, very lucky. These are the avatars that come among us to kind of waken us from our stupor. So I would call them kind of special people, avatars, walking tabernacles of mysticism. So when I talk about ÓLaoire, that's what I have in mind. When I talk then about this notion, this Catholic notion, the communion of saints, which I think is a really beautiful idea, but the languaging of it is horrific. So the Catholic Church divides up the Catholic community into three groups. They call it the Church Militant, which is us here on planet Earth, and then the Church Suffering, which is the souls in purgatory, and then the Church Triumphant was the guys who made it to heaven. Whew. So the language is terrible, but the insight is gorgeous. It's about the unity of all of God's children. It doesn't matter what state we're in a physical incarnated form or in a disincarnated form, we're all part of the unity. We're all concerned for each other, and our compassion reaches across all kinds of boundaries in order to help anybody who's in distress. Now, it's interesting when the Catholic Church came up with the notion of purgatory, this what they call the Church of Suffering. I believe actually it was a form of reincarnation, because purgatory literally means some kind of ongoing purification. So reincarnation is that. We reincarnate from lifetime to lifetime in order to deal with the karma we've generated in previous incarnations. And karma is not simply a punitive mechanism whereby we're punished in subsequent incarnations for mistakes we made in previous ones. Karma is it's the soul plan for an incarnation. We sit down with our heavenly mentors before we incarnate each time, and we create the outlines of what our mission is going to be. So karma literally is that we're born into the circumstances that we created for ourselves. It's not bad stuff, it's the mission stuff. But reincarnation then involves ongoing purification as we try to remember more and more easily and more deeply that basically we are bite-sized pieces of God. We're holographic fractals of Source. So purgatory is kind of the most recent version in Catholicism of that. Now, Jesus, in my opinion, very definitely taught reincarnation. There's a great passage in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 17, about a week before he dies. And Jesus goes up on the top of Mount Tabor with three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John. And he has a powerful visionary experience in which Moses and Elijah appear to him. Now, Moses and Elijah represent the two parts of the Hebrew scriptures, the law and the prophets. Now, Moses, if he existed, was dead 1,250 years before Jesus. And Elijah was dead 750 years before Jesus. But now he's having this encounter with them because he's, in some senses, the fulfillment of both law and prophecy. And as they're coming down the mountain, the disciples say to him, why do the scriptures say that Elijah has to come back before the Mashiach can return, before the Messiah can arrive? And Jesus responded, he said, Elijah has already come back. And they didn't recognize him. And then Matthew adds in parentheses, here he was talking about John the Baptist. So in Jesus' opinion, John the Baptist was reincarnation of Elijah. Then there's this great story in John's Gospel in chapter 9, where Jesus and his disciples are leaving the city of Jericho. And as they're coming out the gates of the city, there's this blind man begging, and he's been born blind, and he's well known to the denizens of Jericho. He sits by the gate begging because he has no way of supporting himself. And the disciples, as they're passing by, say to Jesus, whose fault was it that this man was born blind? Was it his parents' fault, or was it his own fault? Now, that question doesn't make any sense if you don't subscribe to reincarnation. How could somebody be born blind because of their own sin, unless there'd been a previous incarnation for which this was a kind of payback? And so Jesus very definitely taught reincarnation. In fact, the early church believed and taught reincarnation very strongly, right up to the Second Council of Constantinople, which was held in the year 553 of the Common Era. And the council was called by the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople. And only then was this notion of reincarnation condemned and anathematized. And the interesting thing was, there was about 190 bishops from all over the Catholic Christian world that were summoned to this council. The Pope at the time, a guy called Vigilius, refused to attend. And Vigilius was a big believer in reincarnation. And he was summoned to the council by the emperor. He refused to attend. But then once the council had issued its decrees, he finally agreed and he signed off on the condemnation of reincarnation, obviously for some kind of political reasons. We talked then about the notion of indulgences, and I'm sure you Catholics here understand this one well. As kids growing up in a kind of Catholic world, we were taught that there are two kinds of indulgences. There are partial indulgences and plenary indulgences. So a partial indulgence was whereby you could reduce the sentence of a soul in purgatory by a few days or a few years, depending on Rome's protocols. So there were certain kinds of ceremonies or prayers, you could say, and you could reduce the sentence of a soul in purgatory. That was called a partial indulgence. And then there were plenary indulgences where you could get a full reprieve for a soul in purgatory. But there were particular kinds of, there was a protocol to this as well. You had to offer one Our Father, one Hail Mary, one Glory be to the Father, and offer them all up for the Holy Father's intentions. And then you sprang a soul completely out of purgatory. Now it's interesting, the Catholic Church very recently actually changed the rules here. And now you can only get one plenary indulgence. You can't get several in one day. You can only now get one plenary indulgence, and you have to have gone to confession beforehand, received Holy Communion, and pray for the Pope's intentions. So now there's no double dipping. You can't go back for a second. You can't spring two souls out of purgatory on the same day. I mean, it's total mishegas. It's totally made up. So I remember, I'm sure you Catholics among us as kids remember how you behaved on November the 2nd. Now, the belief system was that when you were coming home from school, you could go into the local church and you could go in, say, one Our Father, one Hail Mary, one Glory be to the Father, for the Holy Father's intentions, the Pope's intentions, and you spring a soul out of purgatory. And then you run out of the church and spend like 10 seconds outside and go back in again and repeat the same thing. And after half an hour, we'd start comparing tallies. How many souls did you get out of purgatory right now? So it was like a game. How many can you spring out of purgatory? Being a mathematician, I took this to ridiculous extremes. So when I was in the seminary, we had a particular kind of a book, a seminarian's prayer book. And there were particular prayers that could give partial indulgences and plenary indulgences. So I formed this notion, I wanted to empty purgatory. I was trying to figure out how many partial indulgences and how many plenary indulgences I'd have to do over how many years. And I actually created a mathematical formula. I figured out, the best of my knowledge, the total cumulative population of planet Earth since the beginning of Homo sapiens sapiens was about 111 billion people. So there had been 111 human beings on planet Earth since the beginning of Homo sapiens sapiens. But now, being raised as a Catholic, those who came before Jesus, they're all in hell. So there's no point in me wasting my time on them. They're condemned to hell, because they came before Jesus. And then, so since Jesus arrived, there are maybe, I'm going to reckon, 6 billion baptized Catholics, because only Catholics can go to heaven and only Catholics can be found in purgatory. Everybody else is in hell. But now among the Catholics, any Catholic that died in mortal sin without confession is going to go straight to hell. So there was no point in wasting any time with those guys either. So I had to focus on those who died without mortal sin, but they weren't fully sin-free. And I figured out that was maybe a total about 1 billion people. And then I figured out how much time will it take to get enough partial and plenary indulgences to empty purgatory. And I figured out I mightn't live long enough to do it. So I figured I needed to set up some kind of an NGO, a non-governmental organization, to speed up the process, to bring in a whole bunch of people dedicated to emptying a purgatory. So that's how naive I was at the beginning of my seminary training. So let me end today with a story about my grandfather, whom I called Daddy Jim. He was an extraordinary man. He was a brilliant Irish step dancer. He was also a great musician. He played the concert flute, he played the tin whistle, he played the squeeze bags, the accordion. He played the fiddle. He was really, really good. And he told me lots of great stories about his own childhood. So he told me one time about an event that happened to him sometime around, I'm going to say around 1940. He lived quite near Blarney, for the famous Blarney Castle. And he worked in a foundry in a place called Monard. He was a plater, making agricultural instruments in front of a huge, big furnace and a huge, big hammer. That's how he worked his entire lifetime. So on November 2nd, sometime in 1940, he's coming home from a day at work, covered in grime and really, really tired. But he figures he's going to go into the church in Blarney and he's going to set a bunch of souls free from purgatory. So he goes into the church. The church is completely empty at this stage, and he's had a long day's work. So he's praying to release the souls in purgatory, and he falls asleep. And the sacristan comes and doesn't notice that he's there and locks up the church. So on the stroke of midnight, all of a sudden, he wakes up, and there's this fully vested priest coming out from the sacristy, and the only light in the church is the sanctuary lamp. And the priest stands inside the altar, looks down into the church and asks the question, is there anybody here to answer my mass? Because in Catholic liturgy, there must be a congregation of at least one. A priest can't say mass on his own. There has to be a congregation of at least one. And that was the function of, for instance, altar boys to provide that congregation. And so my grandfather says, I'll answer your mass, Father. And he goes up to the altar rail, goes inside, kneels behind, and the priest starts off, Introibo ad altare Dei. And my grandfather says, Deum que letificat juventutem meam. And the priest says, Dominus vobiscum. And my grandfather says, Et cum spiritu tuo. And they continue to the mass. And at the end of the mass, the priest turns around and he says to my grandfather, what's your name, son? My grandfather says, James Murphy, Father. And the priest then said to him something spine-tingling. He said, I've been coming back here to this church on November 2nd for over 200 years to offer a mass for which I accepted a stipend, but I forgot to say the mass while I was alive. And every time I come back, either there's nobody present to answer my mass, or the few times when I saw somebody in the church, when they saw me, they screamed and they ran away. So I'm telling you now, James Murphy, when it's your time to cross over, I'll be there to assist you. Daddy Jim died on the 4th of December in 1956. I hope the old priest was there to welcome him. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.